Paul Schrader's first Reformed is one of my favourite movies of all time. And here's why. Spoilers ahead. Existential crisis is something that we're all going to experience eventually, some more than others, and chances are you who's watching right now already has at some point. This film deals with a lot of reasons why that is an ever-present feeling in some people's lives, this time using the experiences of one pastor and the multiple tests and questions he's faced with. First of all, I'd like to talk about how the filmmaking drives home some of these questions, which we'll get to in a moment. For one, the first thing you may notice is the aspect ratio. This film is in a 4:3 or 1:3:1 aspect ratio, and though sometimes this is now labelled artsy or pretentious to use, Schrader's reasonings for it are that the vertical lines help frame the human body more. But outside his reasonings, there's a certain claustrophobia to this ratio. It represents a protagonist boxed in. Rarely does anything more than one person at a time take up the whole screen, and in the case of two people, they're quite closely positioned. It's an intimate way of filming. It brings us closer to the characters, brings the characters closer together, but also ultimately alienates the audience. It's like watching a story through a house window where the only thing that separates you from it is the glass pane. Oftentimes characters walk in and out of frame with no real regard to whether you're watching them or not, because it isn't necessarily them you're supposed to focus on, it's what they mean, what they represent. The silences, the empty frames, the stale cinematography, it's there for you to reflect in, like your own safe space for personal reflection. It's absolutely beautiful. The camera rarely moves, it's stagnant, completely devoid of its own life except for two special occasions which I'll get to later on when discussing the end. And these frames, these techniques, they house the questions that the film puts forward to Pastor Tola, to you. One of these questions is a moral quandary of bringing life into a doomed existence. If we're aware that the world is headed for destruction of our own doing, is it not selfish to non-consensually add in another being knowing they're going to be forced to experience this anguish, this lethal extermination we've brought upon ourselves? Because this irreversible damage is happening and the effects aren't to be felt in a million years, they're to be felt soon. The whole point of the planet dying is pretty much the driving force of the entire film. Michael brings these ideas to Tola. He asks the questions that stick with him for the whole runtime, which is, will God forgive us for what we've done to his creation? Which is a venomous question, but also an odd one. It's odd because Michael is said to not be a religious man. Mary said that she was always the spiritual one. She forced him to go there to speak to someone. So why would Michael care for what God thinks of what we've done? My answer is he doesn't. However, he knows how to best put across his message and knows that Tola is a man of God. He brings the feeling of his own existential dread and remorse to the table by translating it in a way that Tola would understand. He leaves him contemplating this question the entire time, to the point where he starts to ask others the same thing, but the difference is this question bounces off every single other person. Tola believes himself to not be capable of love, or at least not anymore, which is wrong. It's a fallacy. He quite obviously loves Mary, maybe romantically, almost certainly, but love comes in many forms. Love is caring and caring is love. Tola cares. That is why this question, these moral quandaries stick with him more than anybody else. And I think this is why he is truly the only religious man in this film. Because I think Schrader goes through great effort to expose how corrupt organised religion can be. They purposefully ignore Tola's cries for help. They use vague interpretations of biblical text to back up blind belief in their made-up morals. They self-preserve by means of accepting handouts from other corrupt organisations and refuse to acknowledge their wrongdoings for the sake of saving their pockets, not caring about whether they save their souls. They make Tola feel crazy for caring about something they refuse to take responsibility for. I say Tola is the only religious man in this movie because one person's relationship with their God doesn't involve any church, pastor, priest, book, text, group, or organisation. Religion isn't a categorized faith system, it's just simply having faith. Mary also falls into this category with Tola, I believe anyway. She says at one point that wherever she found herself, she always sought out a church, meaning she took her religion anywhere. She didn't stick to one place, one group. Her spirituality followed her on her journey. And that's true religion to me. I'm not a religious man. I've prayed, I've visited churches, mosques, gurdwaras, I've participated in Ramadan, I've found spirituality within myself, but the one thing I've always lacked is faith. I'm so jealous of religious people. They have a faith, a belief I can only envy. I wish I had it. Maybe I'll find it one day. Some are drawn to it later in life, much like Tola. At one point he talks to some kids about the first Reformed Church and about its history with aiding slaves. I think the story of the slaves hiding in the cellar of the church is a metaphor for religion itself, or at least Tola's relationship with it. He talks about how terrifying it must have been for them, hiding in the dark on their hands and knees, holding hands, praying for God to help them. Much like himself trying to escape his traumatic past of losing his wife through losing his son by means of forcing him into a life because of tradition. He himself being a veteran, he's experienced sin firsthand. He's experienced the worst of mankind. Through it he found his church. Now every night he's on his hands and knees in the dark praying for God to help him, to help us, to forgive us. He tells Mary the story of his grandfather dying in an elevator, and his last words are requesting his shoes be taken off for he was standing on holy ground. Now, if you didn't know, this is actually a story of Moses and how God asked him to remove his sandals at the burning bush because he was standing on holy ground. He says that this story of his grandfather reminds him of Michael, says that he believes Michael was standing on holy ground when he died. Now, I don't know whether he's taken this story from Moses and just applied it to his life because it's easier to relate to another human that's lost someone this way, or he's just tired of preaching the gospel to somebody. Maybe even because his father was a pastor, that he just knew the story of Moses and he translated that to his own life, to his own death. But either way, the interpretation of the original biblical text is usually that the earth is holy. It's God's creation, and to touch it barefoot is to be closer to God, to be more in touch with all of his creations, not just our own species. This applies to Michael because he's empowered Tola to not just look at humans as God's children, but the environment as equally his creation as we are. This was also Michael's view, but without the religious context. He believed the earth and us are one in nature, and we shouldn't be destroying it, we should be one with it. So Tola is saying that he believes when Michael died, he died on holy ground because not only did he become one with it, he accepted the earth as his equal. Also, in the story of Moses, when he reaches the burning bush, that's when Moses talks to God. And when his grandfather dies, that's when he himself went to go and see God. So maybe he was trying to say in that moment, Michael had become one with God's creations, he embraced them, and is now about to talk with God. These ideas turned Tola to environmental radicalism. He planned on using Michael's suicide vest not as a statement, not as a protest, not to make change, but to make peace with his God, to cleanse himself spiritually. He has so much self-doubt, so much despair without much of any hope. He does say earlier to Michael that a life without despair is a life without hope, which is true, but that doesn't negate that a life without hope is a life with nothing but despair. Which is where Tola is brought to eventually. His health is declining, he has no wife or child, he lost the man he was trying to save, the woman he is most connected to is leaving, his belief system is crumbling, and the only thing he has left to save is his soul. The ending of this film is something that sort of baffles the entire community. Schrader has given vague explanations, the cast themselves have differing ideas of what it means and what was real and what isn't, but though I'm in my own little debate, I'm at the moment believing that Tola went through with the suicide, drinking the drain cleaner, not the suicide vest, because I think he firmly does not want to harm Mary despite his lack of will. I believe this because when he and Mary kiss, the camera starts to move around them, seemingly forever. The only other time the camera moves in this way is during a sort of surrealism moment where he and Mary levitate as they vicariously live for a moment. They syncopate their breaths and shapes. It's almost a fantasy sequence, and then this repeated camera movement enters again for their final kiss, sort of reminiscent of the La La Land what if scene. This is everything Tola wanted, what he wanted his ending to be, but realistically he thinks he has no choice but the one where he goes through with it. This is backed up by the fact that A, Pastor Jeffers isn't able to access Tola's quarters, yet somehow Mary does with no explanation, and B, he's wearing barbed wire, drawing a parallel to Jesus' crown of thorns, and yet when he embraces Mary he doesn't seem to harm her at all. Leading to me thinking the assumption he died via the drain cleaner and not the vest, as this is explicitly him expressing his want to not hurt her. All in all, I think this movie is perfect. I don't think there is a single shred of subpar choice making, acting or directing. It's clean, visceral and overflowing with reasons to be hopeful and reasons to feel despair. So have you seen First Reformed? If so, let me know what you think about it. If not, will you? Let me know. I read every single comment and reply to as many as possible, and whether it's this Paul Schrader masterpiece or not, as always, keep watching movies.